South Africa's Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana delivered his second budget speech yesterday, called the National Budget Speech in Parliament in Cape Town. The National Treasury quantified its balancing act as it attempts to balance national spending priorities and an expanding social wage bill with constrained growth and stifled energy generation capacity. According to the National Treasury, the country's GDP growth will be less than 1% in 2023 due to prolonged and debilitating power outages, weaker global economic conditions, and rising inflation. Government will take now on 254 billion rand of Eskom's 400 billion rand debt over the next 3 years. That's according to the minister. And some 184 billion rand will be paid directly by Eskom over the next 3 years to settle loans. In 2025 to 2026, government will take over 70 billion of rands of Eskom's loans. Strict conditions will apply, and according to the minister, it includes Eskom's ability to implement recommendations from an independent assessment of its operations, which has been commissioned by the National Treasury. So this morning, joining me on the show from Cape Town, South Africa, is a professor of economics, University of Stellenbosch Business School, Professor Andre Rowe. Thank you so much, Professor, for joining us on Business Edge.
It's a pleasure. Good morning, and good morning to all your viewers.
All right, so this is how we are going to start. We are going to watch and take a listen to an excerpt of the Finance Minister of South Africa giving a speech during Parliament yesterday, and we'll begin to scrutinize every detail of what is said and see what positives we can take from it. So let's take a listen.
2023 budget in a difficult domestic and global economic environment. The global recovery is slowing. Domestic load shedding has become more persistent and prolonged, impacting on service delivery and threatening the survival of many businesses. This is compounded by the disruption to freight and logistic networks. Households are under pressure from rising cost of living, and unemployment remains stubbornly high. We are navigating this difficult environment with policies that support faster growth and address fiscal risks. Our pursuit of higher growth remains anchored on 3 pillars. Firstly, we are ensuring a stable macroeconomic environment to create conducive environment for savings, investment, and growth. Secondly, we are implementing growth-enhancing reforms in key sectors, particularly in energy and transport. And thirdly, we are strengthening the capacity of the state to deliver quality public services, invest in infrastructure, and fight crime and corruption.
All right, Professor Andre, well, you heard the Minister of Finance there talking about how the economy is being impacted and how the households are trying to cope. He talked about unemployment rate, and he also talked about how the economy is also affecting the local businesses, the energy sector, and some other critical sectors. But I'd like to take your assessments. How do you feel? Because he talked about the fact that there are government policies on ground to mitigate or to address these certain challenges in these critical areas. What is your assessment of what the government has done or is doing so far to address these areas?
Yes, thank you. Well, I think first of all, let's just confirm and agree with the broad background, and that is the environment is very constrained. Internationally, as we all know, the economy is struggling to grow. And then in South Africa, the same thing. Not just because of electricity constraints, even without electricity constraints, this economy would be struggling to grow by more than maybe 2 or 3%, which is simply not enough. And as has also been pointed out, other constraints include high levels of unemployment. But what we should also add here is that, like in many other countries, because of rising inflation, we've also seen rising interest rates. So the cost of living is rising rapidly for households, and the cost of borrowing money is rising rapidly. Add to that the rapid increase in the fuel price, the petrol price, and all boils down to a very tough environment for ordinary consumers, but also for government. For government to spend more money, it obviously needs to first earn more money. And the tax base is really not growing all that much. It's not growing organically. So there's the one side of this reality. Then he
All right.
mentioned,
Okay.
he mentioned that, yes.
No, go ahead, please.
No, then he mentioned, well, what does government want to do about this? Well, I think, first of all, there is no quick fix. That we have to realize. There are many structural imbalances. But he's quite right, therefore, in saying that one of the most important requirements to attract investors, local and international, and to also sort of stabilize things is having a stable macroeconomic environment.
All right,
Now, what he really
Dr.
means by that-
Dr. Andre, sorry to cut you. You will go ahead to express your opinion, but then we need to quickly go on a break. And when we return, you will continue to give your analysis as regards what the finance minister says so far. So let's quickly go on a break, and when we return, the conversation will continue. All right, so we have been considering the budget speech of the South African Finance Minister, Enoch Godongwana, and what economic policies that the government is bringing on board to mitigate the issues of government spending, the economy, businesses being affected, and of course, other attendant issues that the country and of course the government is grappling with. So I'll just go back to our guest on the show this morning, Professor Andre Rowe, and even as you continue to give your assessment, I would like you to also touch down on the fact that if the finance minister, in terms of the energy crisis and of course the government expenditure, they've been able to strike a balance, because earlier on you talked about the fact that revenues are not coming in for government, but then expenditures is kind of overweighing the government purse. So I'd like you to just touch on that.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So yes, we've got these constraints. At the same time, of course, the demands on the spending side are huge. So he has to obviously prioritize. And the first thing mentioned by him in his speech, which you quoted earlier, was to create a stable macroeconomic environment. Now, what that means in practice in terms of this budget and the last one, and probably the next few ones, is try to put some kind of lid on the very high levels of government debt. The government debt ratio is 70% plus. It'll only start leveling out perhaps in 3 years' time. Meanwhile, the interest we are paying on that is huge. So step number one, to create more confidence, to attract more investment, is to show meaningful progress in stabilizing that government debt. Already that's telling us that the government is not willing to borrow too much additional money to finance additional spending. Then secondly, reforms focusing on energy and transport. Now, I think many people know, you mentioned it as well, that one of the biggest constraints in this country right now has turned out to be electricity. We had a stage, we call it stage 6, where at this rate, up to 2 percentage points of economic growth will be shaved off by ongoing what we call a load shedding or rolling blackouts. So not surprisingly, expectedly, we knew it was going to happen. Government has offered, or not offered, has, let's say, offered to take over a fairly sizable amount of Eskom, the electricity producers' debt. We knew that was going to happen. We weren't quite sure about the amount, but it's certainly more than 50%. It comes with many strings attached, and the idea is that with government assuming that debt, then that frees up resources for Eskom to spend on operating issues, to get the lights on and keep the lights burning. It by itself won't solve the problem, but it'll certainly help to a large extent. Of course, by assuming that debt, it does mean government's own debt burden goes up a bit more than otherwise would be the case. He also announced, and we were warned about this by the president a few weeks ago in a State of the Nation address, there are some special tax breaks for households and for businesses that install solar capacity. Again, the idea being to try to encourage alternative sources of energy.
All right, now talking about tax, Professor, now, is there a possibility that we might likely see a rise in taxes or in the tax bracket, or there will be new taxes to be brought on board to actually scale up the revenue portfolio of government?
Well, there's always a possibility, but that possibility was not mentioned, it's not on the books for this year. In fact, I think in many ways, many of us were pleasantly surprised in the fact that personal income tax rates were not raised. Indeed, he has made provision for so-called fiscal drag or bracket creeping. He did not raise the VAT rate, which is a possibility, although politically very sensitive. He didn't raise that. The corporate tax rate was not raised. In fact, actually, there's a commitment, a long-standing commitment to continuously lower the corporate tax rate. He didn't lower it this year, nor did he raise it. The fuel levy was not changed this year in this year's budget. The only taxes that really showed some increase were what we call the sin taxes, levies on things such as alcohol and cigarettes and the like. But all in all, for a taxpayer, a rather benevolent kind of tax procedures for the year that lies ahead. And that's a pleasant, and it's welcome, given the fact that taxpayers are under extreme pressure for other reasons. What this means, again, is, however, by not raising taxes, by implication, it has put a lid, some kind of lid on government spending, which again means he had to prioritize, and clearly the one priority was to afford assistance to Eskom. Another one was what's become a very interesting issue in South Africa. We have a fairly extensive social grant system, traditionally for older people, for children, and the like. When COVID kicked in a couple of years ago, an additional grant was introduced, an amount for those households in really desperate straits as a result of COVID and unemployment. The amount isn't all that much, 350 Rand, but nonetheless, for those households, it's made a huge difference. That was meant to be a temporary measure, but it has become more than just a temporary measure. And many of these people receiving these grants have become kind of addicted to it. And so, as to be expected, he did announce that this system would be extended for another year, after which, well, we'll have to see. But that does imply naturally specific spending commitments for government. Well, and the third big one, sorry, yes?
Well, the South African government has come out to say that the social wage bill, which of course accommodates the grants being given to vulnerable citizens, will continue. But then
yes,
you have stressed the fact that it's another strain on the government purse. But do you think that the South African government will be able to afford and sustain this social wage bill and continue to provide that sort of welfareism for its citizens?
Yeah, I think in the current form, yes. Where it becomes an issue is there are growing demands in certain circles for a basic income grant for everybody, and a fairly generous one, far more than 350 Rand. Now, that is probably not affordable or even feasible at this stage. In fact, when he was asked about this yesterday, either prior or just after the budget speech, somebody asked the minister, well, how about a basic income grant? And his response was to this person, yes, as long as all of you are willing to pay much more tax. So it's again that same kind of trade-off story. So at this stage, I don't think we are looking at, in the short term, a basic income grant.
All right,
related to that.
All right, okay. Well, we're just trying to exhaust and minimize our time here. Now, let's quickly touch down on the mining sector, which is also regarded as a cash cow for the South African economy, but then it has suffered so much setback because of the power crisis and other bottlenecks. Now, If there's some sort of investments on transformation that will come to that sector, what do you think those should be? And do you think that that sector can actually bring about some sort of economic revolution for South Africa?
Frankly, no. The mining sector in this country is still extremely important, but nowhere near as significant as in days gone by. If we take a look at the contribution of mining to gross value added in the country, it's barely 8%. We also know, as is the case throughout the length and breadth of Africa, that when we do rely heavily on some other form of natural resource, then it's also subject to the international forces of supply and demand, which might lead at times to a commodities boom and other times to just the opposite. Now, what is disappointing is that in the last year or so, despite commodity prices being quite healthy, mining output in this country did not grow all that dramatically. And one of the major reasons, you mentioned one of them, is indeed electricity. The other one is transport infrastructure. It's not always possible because of poor infrastructure to transport the products of mining to and from the mines. So in that sense, it is encouraging that an additional amount of, over the next 3 years, of just over 900 billion rand has been allocated by government to various forms of capital infrastructure projects. But I want to stress, mining itself, the mining sector itself, is not going to solve.
Hello, Dr. Andre.
And a very useful source of some degree of self-sufficiency.
All right, now let's look at what the IMF predicted a while back. It said that the global growth will slow from 3.4% to about 2.9% in 2023. Now, how will that affect South Africa's revenue and the kind of economic revolution is hoping to bring on board?
Well, absolutely. I mean, obviously, South Africa, like many others, is an open economy, which means that our fortunes or misfortunes are often determined by factors beyond our control, such as growth in America, growth in Europe, and indeed growth in Japan and growth in China. So a low growth rate internationally translates into a lower growth rate in our own country. I'm not saying that's the only reason for low growth, but certainly is an important factor. On the slightly more encouraging side, it does look as if the world economic climate today is slightly more favorable than as recently as 3 or 4 months ago. There are interesting signs in both Europe and America of a faster than expected recovery. But I don't think we should use that as a sole reason for more optimism. But to answer your question, we are always subject to the fluctuations of international economic performance.
All right, now let's move on to part of what the finance minister said, and it was made known that Eskom has the intention to transfer part of its debt burden to the government. But some people are actually averse to this, saying that the government is wearing on togas of responsibility, that it might just be too much for it to bear. Of course, 254 billion rand is what the government is hoping to take off Eskom's debt out of 400 billion rand. Now, do you think that is a wise and a right thing to do?
Normally, probably not. In the circumstances, there's not much of a choice in the matter. I mean, as I pointed out earlier, lack of electricity, unreliable supply, it really is hurting us. So it's kind of the lesser of two evils. But you're quite right, by taking on that part of Eskom's debt, it does raise overall government debt. It means that our government debt ratio will take a bit longer, 3 years longer than we first thought to peak. It'll peak at a slightly higher rate, but still at somewhere in the mid 70%. Not so long ago, 3 or 4 years ago, the projections were that total government debt would reach 90%. So really some improvement there. And as I say, it's a typical trade-off. To get more of one thing, you have to give up something else. So given on balance, it is probably, at least on paper, a sensible idea. And it does come, as you mentioned earlier, with various conditions. It's not just a willy-nilly, here's some money, do what you want with it. The Eskom has to comply with various conditions. At the same time, he also hinted very strongly at a growing involvement in supplying electricity of the, let's say, private sector, suggesting that ESCOM should not be the sole responsible agent for supplying electricity. And this is also welcome. It's to be welcome that private suppliers, which may include households, will be encouraged to do so. But you cannot solve, the Minister of Finance cannot keep the lights on. It's not his responsibility to ensure that there's electricity. He holds the purse strings. And the circumstances, I think, is the best he could have done.
All right, an alternative for this power crisis is the renewable energy and all the benefits that it can bring. And of course, the finance minister mentioned that and the potential the country has in that area to drive up power generation and of course bring about some sort of growth in the sector. And according to what he said, is that businesses will be able to deduct about 125% of the cost of renewable energy investments beginning from next month. Now, do you think that will benefit businesses, and do they have the requisite infrastructure to drive that conversation?
I think the quick answer is yes. It's quite a nice enticement. They actually being sort of given a loan of 25% to embark upon this sort of indirectly. I think it's a very intriguing and attractive enticement, bearing in mind that it won't yield results overnight. And we need the lights to be switched on tomorrow, not in 2 years' time. But every bit helps, undoubtedly. It should help us. I think it's also recognizing the fact that the country's energy mix is busy changing, no longer just relying exclusively on, say, coal-driven electricity, but all kinds of combinations, solar, wind, etc. So to summarize, we embarking upon the right overall long-term trajectory regarding the energy mix, but in the short term, anything will help to try to keep the lights on for a bit longer every day.
All right, finally, in a nutshell, Professor, how do you think that the positivity of economic growth can come to South Africa with this budget? Are you also optimistic that this budget can bring about some sort of change this year?
Well, let's say the following. I think the budget itself and the circumstances was a pleasant surprise. It wasn't as austere as it could have been. The budget itself will not, of itself, create lots of economic growth. But going back to the minister's initial objective, one of the preconditions, one of the necessary conditions for future growth and sustained growth is creating a more stable macroeconomic environment and addressing infrastructure. In that respect, I think the budget will make a positive contribution. We cannot expect to see the direct results overnight. That wouldn't happen anywhere in the world. But I don't think the budget will be bad for economic growth, certainly not. It should be marginally positive in the short term and significantly positive in the longer term.
Thank you so much, Professor Andre Real, for joining our conversation. Very insightful.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Yes. Now, despite muted economic growth projections for the year,